Hello, class. Today I'm going to talk about Chapter 5, Part 3. We're going to get into the rise of the Roman Empire. We'll see how far we can get. It's quite a lot of information. All right. So once we get into the actual empire, I'll give a little background to it in just a minute. But overall, we're looking at the empire, the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. This is going to last from 27 BC up to about 192 AD. So almost 200 years, about 200 plus years of relative peace. There will be wars, there will be rebellions, but this will be a time of prosperity like no other. And you will see, I'll give you some prime examples as they go along. We will talk about Augustus, of course, Octavius, his wife, Livia Augusta, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about this art and some of his propaganda. Of course, all art is propaganda in some sense of the word. All right, so we had the assassination of Julius Caesar. Perhaps he had let too many of the senators live. He was not like Sulla in that sense. He didn't go around and murder those that disagreed with him. Many men were killed in war, of course, but he gave clemency. And many of these men then conspired and did kill him. Well, that's going to create another round of civil wars. So now we're in the third civil war in only about 60 or 70 years. And this civil war is going to be worse as far as numbers, devastating, economically, just everything. It's worse. So we need to know about these guys: Octavian, Marcus Antonius, and Lepidus. These men will create a second triumvirate. Octavian and Mark Antony will be rivals, but they will also join forces in the meantime to basically go after the murderers of Caesar. And they will rise armies, both sides will rise armies as large, if not larger, than the armies that Caesar and Pompey had created. Well, there will be many, many battles, but the most important battle, or the final battle here, will be the Battle of Philippi. And you can see here, between Mark Antony and Octavius, they've got close to 95,000 infantry, 19 legions, 13,000 cavalry. That's almost unheard of in a Roman battle. And they're going to have 16,000 of their men killed. Brutus and Cassius's army, the main two conspirators of Caesar's assassination, they've got close to 85,000 infantry and 17 legions, 20,000 cavalry. 8,000 of their men will be killed. Brutus and Cassius at the end of this will both commit suicide, I think separated by a day or two or a few days. And supposedly Brutus will kill himself with the same dagger that he had stabbed Caesar with. And speaking of that, here's a coin that Brutus had commemorated during this time period to pay his soldiers. This is the first coin in antiquity that we have a date on it. The date is Ide Mar, the Ides of March. And an odd thing to celebrate on a coin, but it celebrates the assassination of Julius Caesar. And of course, you see two daggers here, but in the middle here is a Phrygian cap, or the freedom cap. That's a very rare coin. If you had this today, a silver one is probably $8,000 or $10,000. If you had a gold one, you're probably talking £1 million British pounds. I believe that's how much the British Museum just paid for one. Very nice coin, rare coin. All right, so now we have Octavius and Antony splitting up the empire, and eventually their rivalry is going to heat back up. There were rivalries that happened before they even went to war with these men. All right, so they split up the east and west. Let me move my face here so you can see this. This won't be the first or the last time. Well, it'll be the first, but not the last time the Roman Empire will be split up for efficiency's sake, let's say. But these guys are going to rise up like almost two separate kings. The third man involved in the second triumvirate, Lepidus, he's an older gentleman. He will die eventually. And so then that territory has to get split up with these men as well. Well, Mark Antony goes to Egypt. He will marry Cleopatra. She had married Caesar, had one or two kids at least from Caesar. And she will have, I think, 3 children from Mark Antony, twins, and then another child. Well, these two men, the rivalry between them is pretty hot. Mark Antony always seen himself as, a lieutenant of good friend of Caesar and has served him in many campaigns, whereas Octavian was very young when Caesar was killed. I believe he was only about 18 or 19 years old. And so he hadn't got to be raised up by Caesar militarily and whatnot. So Mark Antony always felt that he should have deserved to become the heir, but he was not related to Caesar as Octavian is, his nephew or great nephew, I always forget which, but they're blood related. And Caesar does have a child from Cleopatra, but he can't legally adopt this non-Roman citizen. So anyways, Mark Antony, Octavian, they're going to go to war. Really the war, the Senate, Octavian's going to get the Senate to declare war on Cleopatra. All right. I guess it was easier to go to war with a foreign queen, a foreign woman. But Mark Antony was starting to act non-Roman. He started to claim he was an Egyptian god. He started to give Roman territory to Cleopatra and their kids. And so he was already acting much more like a king in many ways than even Octavius was. So anyways, there's going to be a war declared. There's land and sea battles. The most important battle here would be the Battle of Actium, a very large battle. So you have the Egyptian fleet, which is more ships, but they're also larger. The Roman ships are going to be smaller, but more maneuverable. And you see down here a little map that will show this is going to be near, near Greece. Yes, near Asia Minor. There it is. Not Asia Minor, right here. Anyways, so in this battle, Mark Antony gets surrounded. Cleopatra takes off. She ditches him there. She heads back to Egypt. Mark Antony leaves the rest of his men there as he starts to see it break apart, and he's going to run back to Egypt as well. He will commit suicide. He does not want to get captured. Octavian's men captured and brought into a triumph and be like basically the prize of Octavian. There was maybe a rumor that Cleopatra might have offered herself up to be married to Octavian. He wasn't interested in this at this point, and he will annex Egypt, and then Egypt becomes an imperial province. Will not become a senatorial province. I'll show you that in just a second here. So at this point now, the entire Mediterranean Sea, or the majority of it, supermajority, is under the control of Rome. And now Rome is under the control of one person. So at this point, Octavius is 32 years old. He started his career into politics, we can say, when he was 18 or 19 years old, much the same way that Pompey did, meaning raising up an illegal army in the civil war. Now he is going to be the sole leader, and he will not call himself emperor. He will call himself imperator, which means commander, but he will usually call himself princeps, the first man of Rome, or the first man of the Senate. But now no one else can get that title. So here are the imperial provinces versus the senatorial provinces. So as many of you had discussed in the class discussions that he's going to keep some institutions of the Republic alive. This is intelligent because these senatorial class people still run large swaths of territory, own lots of the grain farms, okay, own millions of slaves, probably so, hundreds of thousands, millions of slaves collectively. And so he cannot disrupt the economy by just getting rid of the Senate. So he still needs the Senate. He's going to use them as a consultative body. He will let them make laws on many things, but he's going to get the power to veto them. All right. Also, what you see here is the provinces in purple will be the senatorial provinces. That means they still control them. They'll send out their people. There aren't many armies, if any at all. There will be a few armies involved in this. The majority of the army, though, will be in the imperial provinces in red. So it's the periphery. And these will all come under the control of Augustus. And he will send out his own delegates, his legate, and they will be governors and generals. All right. Now, as far as Augustus, getting up to that point of calling him Augustus, this is a title, almost a religious title. He is the illustrious one, the first one, and he will also take the title of Divi Filios, the son of the divine god Caesar. So if you're the son of a god, I mean, what does that make you? No one's worshiping him in Rome yet. They don't worship living people in the West. Now in the East, there will be people, there will be temples set up to him, and there will be people in Asia Minor, in Syria, that will worship Augustus and other emperors while they live. Okay, this still would have been odd for a Roman even to bow to a person or use the word king or rex. They don't like this. You're not going to have any of the Romans really bowing to people or seeing a divine kind of character of a king openly accepted, an emperor, excuse me, until Diocletian. So it's going to be another 200 years until Romans accept that. So what does he do? Slowly, he starts to gain all the powers of the consul, all the powers of the tribuneship and the censor. This means he can remove people from the Senate. This means he can veto any of the consuls or praetors. And as the consul, for the first couple of years, he just keeps the consulship all as his. Then he's going to allow 2 of their sub-consuls. He'll still keep consular power, which he can veto. After all, he's pretty smart. He kind of retires from the Senate. And he only shows up on rare occasions. And the day-to-day business of the empire will still be run by the Senate. He doesn't want to get rid of them. But when something serious needs to be done, he can just do it by edict. All right. One good thing about this guy, very different from those other men on your quiz, those generals and governors. He has an ego, yes, but it's different than the others. He understands his limitations, I think, much more than some of those previous generals. He delegates authority and he does it well, and he's not jealous of those he delegates authority to. He knows he's not really the best general. He's not a good general, really. He's a good administrator. He's a good politician. But his friend here, Agrippa, this will be one of the best generals of even the late Republic, and a friend of his since they were kids. They went to school together, and this is a middle-class guy. This is an equestrian rank, knight, and he'll be elevated up to senatorial class, and he is given many, many of the military honors that before, like a Caesar or a Sulla would want to jealously guard. Augustus has no problem elevating his friends up and giving them positions that he knows they're better at. So it's probably one way he keeps up the peace too. He's got a lot more people, a larger cabinet, so to speak. He's going to actually build up administrative agencies too. The Roman Republic didn't have like really bureaucracies. They changed every single year, and that just wasn't efficient. And so he's going to create permanent public works, permanent like firefighters, permanent police, basically. Those things didn't exist, at least on an administrative level, until the empire. He's also going to keep up a navy to protect trade, because piracy had come back 3 or 4 times. But now that Rome controls the entire Mediterranean, they're going to have security for their merchants. Now his propaganda minister, his minister, patron of the arts, will be Mycenus. This is also a friend going back to his youth. And under this person, you will have the arts flourish. Among them, Virgil's Aeneid will be written. Virgil's Aeneid is really the Romans, not version, but basically their part 2 or 3 to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is all about the Roman people fleeing the Trojan War and becoming the Romans. All right. And very much is a propaganda book, beautifully written. Virgil tried to destroy it, but Mycenus thought it a masterpiece and kept it there. And really, if you read the Aeneid, it sets up the family, the whole family of the Julius Caesari as the fathers of the state. And so then Augustus will become the paterfamilias, the father of the state, just like a father of the family. And they're related to Venus, or so this propaganda will say this. So there's religious and political tying together in this work. Under Augustus, also, you get a lot of other legal and moral reforms. It's kind of hard to describe this unless maybe you think about this of like post-World War II in this country. We lost 500,000 or so people in the war. So when men came back, they wanted to kind of create a normalcy, whatever that means exactly. And so there was a time, 10 years or so, where there was a baby boom. All right. They wanted people to get back to normal, get back to work, get married, have children, and they would incentivize this. Augustus does the same thing, and it's really for very similar reasons. After those wars, you have 3 generations of civil war, and you probably have a couple million people dead, not just a couple 100,000, you have a few million people dead from war and famine and disease because of all these wars that span all over the Mediterranean. And so he's got to recreate this idea of normalcy, if you will. It's a construct, but they create their own form. And the Roman Empire is being constructed here as well. Lots of imagery, all of his art coming about. There's always, or usually, quasi-religious connections to that as well. The veteran soldiers, as I pointed out back here, majority. There's probably 20 or 30 legions around here, and there's probably 4 or 5 legions that the Senate control. These men are all in his direct pay. Augustus's, Octavian's bank account, let's say, you couldn't separate this from the state treasury. Really, you could not. So all these men are paid out of his treasury. They're given land in his name. So these men are loyal to him, but now he is the state. Okay, before we had those men loyal to generals and not the state. He is now the state, though. So he's going to bring a lot more stability. The problem with the stability, think about this, there had been almost 100 years of civil war, murders on the thousands, okay, as far as with amongst the senatorial class, especially being murdered without trials. And then, of course, hundreds of thousands of soldiers being killed on battlefields. So people were ready to even give up a bit of their freedom for safety, right? We've probably heard that before. That might not turn out well, but for the Romans, this is actually going to turn out well. Some Romans will lose some of their freedom, but they will gain safety, prosperity. So religion-wise, I'm going to move my face here so you guys can see this. So as I said before, they set Augustus up as the father of the state, just as if he was the father of the family. The family is the empire now, though. And so the religion of the state and the religion of the family household is coming together. He is going to inherit the title of Pontifex Maximus from Lepidus, who had gotten it from Caesar or was elected afterwards. The interesting thing about this, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of all the priests in Rome, at this point will now only be allowed to be in the hands of the emperor, all right? And that will remain in the hands of the emperor until way later they hand it over to the popes. The Catholic popes will get that title. So the imperial cult comes about, and it's the cult of the whole family, right? You can give some kind of hero worship to all the kids, all the grandkids, Augustus, Augusta, and they're tied with bringing peace to the state, which is now their family. And that's the Pax Romana we're talking about, the Roman peace. But I also said, remember, no one really in the city of Rome is worshiping Augustus until he dies. After he dies, though, there will be temples, and there are temples to some of the Caesars, not all of them. Some of the Caesars are actually officially damned when they die. Tiberius will be damned. Caligula and Nero, of course, they will be damned. And really, even after the Julio-Claudians go away, not every single emperor is worshipped after they died. Only the best ones usually are remembered for decades afterwards, and they're remembered for pragmatic reasons. They ran a good state, they ran a good government, and there was peace. And so people really are worshiping that, the peace that they brought, so the Pax Romana. Okay, here's the altar of peace right here, the Areopagus. This is in Rome right here, and this basically shows the family of Augustus and the greater family, because he will marry his daughter or sister, I almost always forget because their names are so similar, to Agrippa. Okay, and then Agrippa and she will have kids, and those kids will be the grandsons of Augustus. He never has sons, he only has a daughter, and he has a sister, and he will have grandsons. But his grandsons actually won't succeed. It will be the grandsons of his wife. He married his wife when she already had 2 kids, and those kids married into Augustus' family. Those will be the Claudians of the Julio-Claudians. And I'll get into that in a second here. All right, so Roman expansion. Well, it's not too much after Augustus takes over. As he gets older, as he's dying, as his 2 grandsons die, they die when I think they're 17 and 19 years old from sickness or some kind of mysterious illness. Not sure. They're on the way back from some campaigns. They're starting to get a name for themselves, and they die. Some people conjecture that, his wife killed them. I don't know, because she wanted her son, Tiberius, to become the emperor, and he will be adopted by Augustus. So Tiberius comes in, his stepson, and he will be the next emperor. Augustus tells him, don't really take much more, consolidate what we already have. He and his brother had been pushing up into the Germanies quite a bit. And so parts of the Germanies will be annexed, but all of the Germanies never will be completely conquered by the Romans. In fact, the Germans will come conquer the Western Empire eventually. So you have the Rhine and the Danube lines. At one point, there'll be 13 or 14 military forts with 5,000 to 6,000 men each, all along that border right there, keeping the other Germans out. Okay. Already in Augustus's time, though, you will note that 1/4 of the Roman army is already German. These are Romanized, though, Germans. These Germans speak maybe a little bit of German, maybe not much anymore, but they definitely speak Latin, and they probably speak 2 or 3 other languages, and they're moved all over the empire. So they've assimilated. They're Roman citizens. So it's just an interesting thing to note. 1/4 of the Roman army is German at this point. You do have 3 legions lost in Germania. I won't get into that too much, but this is one of the things that keeps them from expanding too much. It's too expensive to expand too much or too fast. So they usually stay with the lines. The Roman Empire will expand and contract very little over the next 200 years. In the east, they make a treaty with the Parthians. These are that second Persian Empire rising up. They'd stop them from going to Syria by annexing Syria in the 60s BC under Pompey. And they're going to have not an uneasy truce. They have a truce with them pretty much off and on for the next 200 years. They do fight with the Parthians on occasion, but they usually respect each other, and they know that both empires are formidable and potential enemies. So there's some respect there. Finally, you get a little bit of conquest with Claudius going back into Britannia. Caesar had gone there almost 100 years before, set up some tributary kings, and everybody kind of forgot about them, and so they stopped paying tribute and taxes. Well, Claudius goes back as the new emperor, probably in his late 40s, early 50s, and he needs to make a name for himself, and so he goes in and annexes just the bottom part of England. They don't really mess too much with Scotland, and they will decide not to go into Scotland after a few campaigns, and then they'll bring in Wales a little bit later on. But they really just want the most lucrative part, the bottom like 1/3, maybe 2/3 of what you would call the UK today. And you see here's some Roman armor of the time. They're still using chainmail. They started to bring in this segmentata. This came from Persia. Some of this came probably from the Seleucid Empire and or the Persians, the second Persians. Here's my experimentation with it a couple years ago. It's a little bit crude, heavy. It doesn't feel good to sleep in, and sometimes a Roman soldier had to sleep on a wall or a rampart. So they did slowly go back to the chainmail. This was easier to make or cheaper to make and easier to maintain, I guess. But people went back to the old faithful, if you will. They liked the chainmail. And like I said, you can sleep in chainmail. It's still not very comfortable. It's more comfortable than sleeping in this plate armor. All right. And anybody can actually fix chainmail too. You don't need a lot of tools. A couple pairs of pliers, and you can basically fix a few holes in it. And here's the Roman Empire at its height. So probably between Trajan, Hadrian time period, although under Trajan, they do conquer the Persian Empire, and Hadrian will give it back because, once again, they don't want to expand too fast. It wasn't worth it. And they set up another Persian king and just leave the area. But you do see still in control of the Mediterranean for a couple hundred years. No one before and no one after does that. And just some examples of Roman soldiers around here. The eagle bearer. Here's some maybe Germanic, I forget, Germanic or Slavic auxiliary troops collecting heads, still acting a little barbaric, I guess, there. And just the discipline of the armies here. And some of their siege devices, like a scorpion. They would have had various sizes of catapults and whatnot. Very good at sieges, the Romans. They could sap, dig undermine walls. They were very good at taking down fortified positions. They were good at building fortified positions too. Anytime the Roman Empire showed up basically to your region, they would build incessantly roads, bridges, aqueducts, sewer systems. They're all over Europe to this day. There are still sewer systems and waterways that work, that are built originally by the Romans, or there are sections of modern systems that still are on the foundations of Roman systems. Here is an example here, a fort castle, and fort castle, excuse me, this is a legionary fortress. I'll show you a fort castle. This is just one. This is called Housesteads, Hadrian's Wall. That's probably my picture right here. These are the aerial pictures, are not mine, but it's the same place. So these fortresses used to hold about 4,000 to 6,000 men. And you can probably tell here, there were large towns outside of them. Most of the large cities, you know, in Europe today were at one time Roman fortresses that they built around, like Cologne, Germany. That was called Colonia Agrippina at one time. That was a Roman fort. So yes, these men, if they weren't in fighting or whatnot, they would always be building something. They didn't just sit around and guard all day. They built roads. So most Romans were some level of engineer architect, especially after 10 or 20 years of service. They were quite handy. And here's a Mile castle on Hadrian's Wall, one in the desert here. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. So of course the drier areas, they actually they hold up pretty well. Some people had used these in the Middle Ages and you couldn't tell how old they were really. Now, if you have moisture, they'll fall over, but also Hadrian's Wall, a lot of people throughout the Middle Ages would have stripped off the stone and used that to build their house or like a corral for their animals. So we get to the Julio-Claudians. Let's look at these individually just a little bit. They're interesting characters. You could spend an entire semester on just reading these people, and they're more exciting than a soap opera for sure. So of course, like I said, we have Augustus had married Livia, and Livia was pregnant with her second son when she marries Octavian, which seems kind of weird, and even the Romans thought it was kind of odd. And this was the enemy of one of his, the wife of one of his enemies during the civil wars. But she's very powerful. She's one of the wealthiest families in Rome. So it's a political match, but he also really loves this woman. I mean, if you read their dialogue together from some of the histories, she was always part of his administration. She gave him counsel and he took advice from her. When he dies, she will also give advice to her son, Tiberius, and in some ways almost runs the empire until she dies. Tiberius is an interesting character. You hear a lot of things about him that kind of malign him, and it's hard to know what's true and what's gossip from the ancients. But one thing is true. He was a warrior. He was a general, but he was also a pretty good administrator. He was quite an educated man. For a time, he retired when he thought Augustus's grandchildren were going to take over, so he retires to his own island. Kind of became like a philosopher. It almost seemed like he didn't want to be the emperor, but then he's recalled. He's adopted formally by Augustus, and he becomes the emperor. While emperor, though, he does have a Praetorian Guard commander who starts running at least Rome pretty much like his own thing, and is looking to maybe have a coup. That man will be killed. That is Sejanus, if you want to look into that. Interesting. And then eventually Tiberius is going to adopt not his own son. He has a son, but he's going to adopt his brother's son, or his brother's son, Caligula. And we all know him as Caligula, but most of these guys will have the title of Julius Caesar, and then you add on the other names. Caligula starts out his reign pretty well. He's a young man, probably too young, but then something happens. He gets like physically sick, and then he's got maybe some mental illnesses, and he starts to run the empire very poorly. He's only going to have a 4-year reign, and he will be assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. Then the Praetorian Guard will set up his uncle, Claudius. They set Claudius up because they thought he was an invalid, or not invalided, but they just thought he was feeble-minded. And for most of his life, he does have a speech impediment. He has a bit of a kind of a limp. His name, it's sad to say that his name Claudius means clubfoot. I mean, that's kind of mean, but if you know anything about Latin nicknames, sometimes you get a nickname that's not very nice and it just sticks with you. And that's where Claudius gets his nickname, from having kind of a limp and hunched over. And even as the emperor, he keeps that name. Sounds odd to an American to have someone who's a king or an emperor with a mean nickname. But this guy's like a philosopher king too. He kind of hammed up his disability. He does have a speech impediment, but he pretended for years and years while some of his cousins are getting murdered by Caligula that he's this helpless older uncle. And so it makes him survive. And once he becomes the emperor, he still, has a little bit of a stutter and a limp, but he's very intelligent. So this guy is quite a survivor. He's a builder of many things, many aqueducts, roads, and bridges. He does actually go to Britannia and help start take over, or at least be there in some of the final stages. Whereas his nephew earlier went to go on campaign and got to the channel, looked across there and decided not to go over to Britannia, and told his army to collect seashells and rocks and go home and have a triumph over conquering the Celts there, which was a joke. Okay, so Claudius goes there and actually does it. Claudius also has a son. I forgot to say, Tiberius, his actual son, ends up getting poisoned and dies around the time Caligula takes power. Same thing's going to happen with Claudius's natural son, Britannicus. He's going to be poisoned probably by Nero. All right. Nero is going to be his stepson, but also his nephew. And this is where it gets kind of soap opera-esque. Agrippina the Younger, one of the most powerful women in antiquity and definitely the most powerful Roman empress, because she's the granddaughter of Augustus. She's the niece of Tiberius. She's the niece of Claudius. She is the cousin of Caligula, and she's the mother of Nero. All right. And as empress, she's also going to marry Claudius, her uncle, which is weird. Even for the Romans, they had to make a special law just for her and him to get married. I don't know if this was a consummated marriage or if it was just for politics. But anyways, it's going to bring Nero closer to the emperor rank because he's going to get adopted. So anyways, Tiberius is going to die probably in his mid to late 50s. I think it's late 50s. A lot of people don't know if he got poisoned by Agrippina the Younger. I don't think so, because she probably had as much power, if not more, as the empress than the emperor's mom. Although she's going to have a lot of power over her son for the first couple of years, because he's about 19 or so when he comes to power. Much like Caligula, Nero, his first couple of years are good, kind of a liberal rule, but it's also because his mom's probably running the show. He really wanted to be like a rock star. He wanted to go and sing poetry and go to the Olympic Games, not for the physical ones, but Olympic Games also include like the reading of poetry and things of that nature. So he wanted to be like this rich, spoiled brat, just like Caligula. Both of these men spend like the entire treasury, whereas the older men before them had filled the treasury, were fiscally responsible, built up the empire, made things better. These guys bleed the empire. Eventually, Nero is going to have his mother killed. He has 2 different attempts on her life. We don't know exactly all the reasons behind this, because she might have wanted him dead too. She had 2 marriages, I believe, before even her uncle, and one of them, the guy dies kind of mysteriously, and she gets rich off it. So we're not sure. But anyways, while she's the empress, though, she had always had a chair hidden in the Senate, like behind a shroud, and she would listen to the Senate meetings when foreign dignitaries would come speak to her husband, Claudius. She would actually sit right next to him, and she would sit next to him in a chair that was made only for like a praetor or a consul. When she would walk around the city, she would have, I believe it was 5 or 6 lictors, as if she was a praetor. No woman ever did that in Rome. The Vestal Virgin, the chief Vestal Virgin, had one of those bodyguards. So she's walking around as if she has imperium power. Interesting. I think Livia Augusta only usually had one of those bodyguards. So she was even pretty careful to project that kind of power. Whereas Agrippina, she felt the dignitas. She had both sides. She was both Julio and Claudian. So I don't know, one of the most powerful women in many different ways in ancient Rome. So anyways, the son eventually has her killed. The Praetorian Guard won't even do it. He asks the Praetorian Guard to kill his mom, and they say absolutely not. The leaders of the Praetorian Guard had been put up into power because of her. So he has to use some sailors to go and kill her at her home after he tried to have some boat collapse on her. It's a crazy story. You got to go read it, but it's not funny, but interesting. So anyways, at the end of all that, a few years later, he's going to be declared an enemy of the state. There's a lot of bad things going on. The Senate wants him dead. He ends up killing himself. Actually, he doesn't have the spine to do it. He has a slave kill him. And he says as he dies, the world has lost the greatest actor there has ever been. And then he dies. I mean, that's kind of how off he was there. All right, so there we got the Julio-Claudians. That's going to set up the year of 4 emperors. There's going to be civil war for a year because of his death. At the end of that war, we're going to have the Flavian dynasty. So the year of 4 emperors, I guess you could say 5 emperors, because Nero's dead in that year, but you have Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. Vespasian comes out on top. Vespasian had been involved in the Jewish wars, which had erupted under Nero. Nero and Caligula both had upset the Jewish peoples by having their image, the emperor's image, put inside the temple. Augustus never did that. Augustus actually respected the Jewish people's faith, and he paid for them to give sacrifices to the Roman Empire every day. So, like I said, Nero, Caligula, both spoiled brats, thinking they should be worshipped as gods, and that's going to upset the Jewish peoples. There's going to be a revolt. There's other reasons behind it too, but that's one of the reasons. So Vespasian, during the time of Nero, will be in charge of these Jewish wars. They're horrible, horrible wars. Some of the best reading you'll ever have on Roman warfare will be about the Jewish wars, written by Josephus, who would have been one of the Jewish commanders and governors who's defeated, but then later adopted by Vespasian and becomes part of their family and writes a pretty good history. That's one of the only books of Roman warfare that I've read more than 2 or 3 times because it's so good, at least sections of it completely, like twice, but it's pretty good. And then so this guy's a short dynasty, him, his older son, his younger son. His older son will be a warrior, a good kind of stable person. His second son, though, once again, kind of a spoiled brat and kind of lets things spiral out of control, and he'll be assassinated too. But under the Flavians, though, they bring it back more to, as much as they can, to kind of the old austere Roman way of life, if you will. Even himself as the Emperor Vespasian, I think he fasted once a week. He didn't like dying too decadently, and even tried to make laws against showing off your wealth too much, which was really hard to enforce. But he was really concerned with just over decadence because he saw that was a problem with Caligula and Nero. Also, I guess you should note this too, under Vespasian is when the Colosseum will start to be built up. This was supposed to be like a private house and garden for Nero, and there was a statue, the Colossus of Nero, and that's why they call the Colosseum because it was built next to that. And they'll turn that statue into, I think, Sol Invictus, or the sun god eventually, but they don't make it after one of the emperors. So yeah, Nero was totally full of himself. But Vespasian is going to build an amphitheater. I don't think he gets to see the construction finished. His son takes over and then opens it up, and then it's like public games for free with free food all the time, and people love it. Here's the Arch of Titus, and this depicts the final victory over the Jewish peoples in the Jewish rebellion. This would also coincide with, or maybe just before that, the Battle of Masada. All right, here you see the collapse of the temple. They actually have the candelabra from the Holy of Holies. Who knows what happens? Some people think it's buried somewhere. I'm sure they melted it down eventually, but that's crazy. If you go to Rome, you can still see this today. So if you're over on the, let's see, the left-hand side here, that would be where the Colosseum is, and you'd walk, if you walked under or around this arch, you'd be in the ancient Roman Forum. And I don't think you'd walk under it now. When I was there, you had to walk around it. They were afraid parts were going to fall on your head or something. All right, we get to the 5 good emperors. So we skipped over some stuff here, but this is the height of the Roman Empire. Okay, we have Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, Marcus Aurelius. A lot of people would say they're the 5 good emperors because they're the adoptive emperors. None of these men have a son, living son, on the throne until you get to Marcus Aurelius, and then his son takes over. And his son's a spoiled brat, and his son is nothing like him. And the cycle of civil wars will happen once his son comes to power and is assassinated. Then you have like 6 years of civil wars and about 4 or 5 other emperors jockeying for power. I don't know if we'll have time for all that. But anyways, it's the height because these guys are adopting the best guy for the job. Nerva's an older gentleman. He comes into power, and the Senate makes him the emperor as kind of a placeholder. He had children, but he outlived one of his sons or both his sons. And Trajan will be a governor general in the German regions and was very good at it. He had 4 or 5 legions, a well-balanced person. So he's adopted. He becomes the emperor. He has a daughter, I believe, but no sons. Hadrian's like a distant cousin of his. He adopts Hadrian. Hadrian comes to power. And Hadrian and Trajan, people usually say that's the height of the Roman Empire. Hadrian has no children at all because he's an open homosexual, which is kind of like odd because you're a lot of people, maybe in the 70s, 80s, maybe 60s and 50s, are like, oh, the Roman Empire fell because they were decadent and they were open to, you know, sex and sexuality. No, not really at all. They were open to sex and sexuality, but at their height, their emperor was openly homosexual. Some of their emperors were bisexual, openly bisexual. But anyway, so Hadrian, if he gets married, it's just for politics. He does not have children. He has a couple boyfriends. That's about it. There is another relationship with the Jews. There is another rebellion under Hadrian in the Jewish regions. He is going to force a diaspora again. He outlaws the Jewish faith in Judea, which sounds crazy. He outlaws circumcision. One thing Hadrian does is interesting is he outlaws the enslavement of Greeks. He said the Greek people are superior to Romans, culturally speaking, and he really was into Greek culture. They called him the Greekling, actually. Antonius Pius, he's going to adopt him, but on the promise that he's already going to adopt Marcus Aurelius and this other man named Lucius Verus. And Lucius Verus's father, also Lucius Verus, was one of Hadrian's lovers, okay, but was also a general. So Antonius Pius and Hadrian aren't even really like each other at all, but he says, you know what, if you adopt these 2 young men, I'll adopt you. So he's also a placeholder. Antonius Pius's daughter will be married to Marcus Aurelius, okay? So you kind of see how these men are kind of helping each other up, but they're not, they're picking the best men for the job. Hadrian even said, why would you have children of your own when you know they're going to turn out to be basically kind of like Nero or Caligula? He's like, go find, there's plenty of good men out there who just need a little bit of help, or pick the best man and then elevate them, you know, once they're already an adult. So, I mean, he's picking the best man for the job. So we get down to Marcus Aurelius. Like I said, he's the first emperor, I think, in 96 years or 90 some years to actually have a son while he's on the throne, okay? And he's going to give his kid the power. I mean, it's his son. As smart as this man was, as wise, he was the philosopher king for sure. This guy was a Stoic. He writes his own meditations, okay, on Stoicism, but he's also a really good general, really good administrator. He's fighting the German tribes most of his entire life. He's starting to settle some of the Germans, though, just across the border, which may or may not have been a bad thing. And his son has to do that even more and more and more. Some of these super tribes, like the Marcomanni, are 200,000 in size, okay, or more. And they're putting some of those tribes on the Roman side of the border. And they're going to use them to guard the German border against the Germans, which sounds weird. But we get to the next chapter, you can see there's a problem with that. So anyways, his son comes to power. His son is Commodus. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, that's Commodus. And you know what? The movie does not do enough shame to him because it's very light to really what he does. He probably kills hundreds of people in the Colosseum in front of 50,000 people because he's such a megalomaniacal person that he wants people to see him kill people, okay? No emperor ever did that before. A few senators had done that before, and they were even made fun of or told that they were savage for doing that. But this is an emperor wanting to be a gladiator, wanting to pretend to be a slave, okay? So far beneath his dignity. And anyways, he'll eventually be strangled by his lover and favorite wrestling partner. His wife was probably involved in an assassination too. And then you get another cycle of civil wars. I know it's exciting, isn't it? Civil wars after civil wars, but you do get quite a long period of peace and prosperity under these emperors, and even under some of the Julio-Claudians as well. There'll be some emperors after this where there's some good times too, but it's going to be kind of rocky up and down after this. And we'll get into that in the next chapter more so. So here are the 5 good emperors. You can kind of see beards coming in out of style. Hadrian, excuse me, because he's a Greekling. And Greeks, it was more of a philosopher thing to have a beard and a Greek thing to have a beard. So some Roman entertainment ideas on this here. You know, they do borrow a lot of Greek things. I think I said before, the bottom part of Italy, there were more Greeks living in southern Italy in antiquity than there were in Greece. So the Romans are, mixed culturally a lot, not just from Greeks, but from all over the Mediterranean. So anyways, trying to say here. Okay, yeah. So obviously, if you have a new emperor or a time after civil war, you're going to have a little bit more clamping down on freedom of speech. So during Augustus's reign, it's going to take a few decades, and he'll start to loosen up on literature and kind of letting things go. But you have to get into the Five Good Emperors time to really get the freedom of literature. Even you're allowed to make fun of the emperor. I believe it was the emperor, yeah, Trajan over here. He used to invite comedians to the palace and have huge parties, and he'd have the comedians roast him, like make fun of him in front of everybody. I mean, what does that say about an emperor or a king, that he doesn't care that you make fun of him? It's kind of like the court jester too. That lets off steam. Everyone's like, okay, whew, we're okay. This guy's not heavy-handed. We're allowed to make jokes. He doesn't take himself too seriously. That's a good thing. Roman art. Well, the most original thing that Romans do, artistically speaking, not dramas. Dramas they take that from the Greeks, but what they do with plays, they're really into satire, political satire especially. They excel in this. For art, though, frescoes are the most original thing they do, and some of the best art they do is frescoes. And really only in certain parts in Italy. It's almost like the Goldilocks zone here. Frescoes, it can't be too wet or too dry climate-wise, or it'll flake off the wall. So what do we see here? Some crazy stuff, I guess, here. A lot of these things, people used to, when they went into, say, Pompeii and other places, they excavated, they saw very explicit sexual frescoes. Like, it would appear to be in someone's living room, and they're like, there's no way this is living room. This has got to be a brothel, right? It turns out, no. They did have quite sexually explicit paintings sometimes in when you first walked in their house. This would have been normal. This is Priapus, yeah, the god of erections. This was kind of like your ADT sign, the security company. This guy was supposed to attack criminals that broke into your house. It's also supposed to make you laugh when you come in the house, to scare away evil spirits. Romans still kept their ancient beliefs in good spirits and bad spirits, almost like feng shui, if you will. And then you would have, other things that would be above your breakfast table, perhaps, that might not be normal for us puritanical Americans. Romans were very open sexually when it came to art. Maybe not for their family or their kids and whatnot, but as far as art, they knew the line between, fiction and fantasy and reality. Okay, but they weren't really ashamed of the body. Definitely, like the Greeks. Not as much as the Greeks, even. The Greeks definitely were very open about showing the nude form. Just some close-ups on here. And of course, this woman here is showing that she's literate, because she has a wax tablet here, taking some notes. And so, that's a way to show off your affluence, your wealth, that you are literate. Architecture. So for Rome, we do need to point out what they did maybe better than other people or expanded on. And one of the things they do is, of course, create the arch, the true arch, and domes. You need concrete. They invented a type of concrete. The concrete they invented could actually set underneath the water too. So they're able to make ports and harbors out of a concrete. And here you see there's two pictures of the same thing here, an aqueduct in Spain, Segovia here. And you notice there's like a 4-story building over here. This is a massive, massive aqueduct. Some of these aqueducts still work. Okay, many of the aqueducts closer to Rome and some of the cities near there were knocked down or broken by the Germans when they invaded. And they don't know how to make concrete. So for a couple hundred years, you don't have fresh, clean running water going to a lot of those cities. And that's why you won't be able to have cities over a couple thousand. You could have a city of 1 million people if you have proper running water and sewer, as almost all the Roman cities in their empire had a sewage system and running water. And here's a bridge and aqueduct. Some of them would serve the same thing. Some of these you can still see cars driving over them. If you're driving in Rome itself, you look down at the street and some of the bricks still have Augustus's stamp in it, and there's cars driving on it. I mean, that's how how good these guys could build roads and bridges and everything else. Here's the Pantheon, and here's, of course, is a vaulted dome with, I forget what to call this, coffers inside, where they kind of make recesses in it, makes it lighter. This is made with concrete, but it's also made with broken up pottery to keep it lighter, excuse me. This will be the largest dome, natural dome, meaning it holds itself up, until the Hagia Sophia is built. And then I think the Hagia Sophia will be the largest dome until St. Peter's Basilica is built in the 1400s. And this is still, I think, the third largest natural dome on Earth. And this would have been built or rebuilt under Hadrian or Trajan. Originally, this building was built under Augustus. Agrippa actually had the original Pantheon built. It's a beautiful building. The oculus right here, the eye, is 33 feet across. That also helps it hold it up. And you can also, just rain comes through there, of course, too. Here's the outside. And if you're in Italy, anywhere in Italy, you're going to see this. I've only been to Rome, and 7 days in Rome is not enough time, that's for sure. But it's interesting. The old and the new just next door to each other. So there'll be an ancient building right here. There'll be a Renaissance building over here, and there's a McDonald's across the street. It's hilarious. Don't go to McDonald's if you go to Rome. Eat, Italian food. There's really good food there, obviously. Rome entertainment, gladiatorial games, and other things that went on in the Colosseum. And before the Colosseum, like in the Roman Republic, there was no Colosseum, but they had amphitheaters. Okay, so they'd have plays in there, but they'd also have like smaller gladiatorial fights. Gladiatorial fights really don't become popular until about 100 BC, and they came from southern Italy and moved their way up into Rome eventually. Gladiatorial fights do start out as a funeral game in the ancient period, if you will, that probably has something to do with a blood sacrifice, to spill the blood of these slave warriors for an important dead person you were going to bury or cremate, more likely cremate. Most Romans were cremated, not buried. The Colosseum, you would have hunts in there, gladiatorial fights, wrestling, boxing, and you see here it's filled with water. This thing is fully plumbed. You could fill it up with water and drain it like a bathtub. And the next day, have a battle in there with a bunch of dirt. All right, so right there's ships in there, full-scale war. Sometimes a couple hundred or a couple thousand guys beating each other up. And to make it more exciting, when the water's in there, they'd throw like hippopotami, alligators, crocodiles. You couldn't just hide in the water. You'd get attacked with that too. So 50,000 people could fit in this Colosseum. And there's, I think, 27 or 30 entrances and exits. And since they didn't have to worry about modern day security, you could fill this thing completely up and empty it completely out in about 10 minutes or less. That is ridiculous. That's pretty awesome. They don't have to worry about, bomb detectors, back then. So very efficient. And on some days, this would just be opened up as a marketplace. So this was not a wasted real estate property, if you will. And it would have been largely intact. You see this piece chopped off here and all the nice cover stones ripped away, and all the seating cover stones were ripped away in the Renaissance to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. So this would have been largely intact until the 1400s. Okay. If you go to Rome today, you walk by that 10 times, it will shock and awe you every time you see it. It's so massive. Other things we need to know about the legacy of Rome: Roman law. This will affect Europe even to this day, the United States to this day. They had a couple types here, 3 types. They have civil law, ius and mos. Ius is like justice, more secular law, and then there's moral tradition. They used to be combined and they separated later on. Their first lawyers would have been priests, and the priest you would have gone to a priest and paid them money to get a formulae or a way to talk and a way to act in court. Later on, that breaks and you get secular lawyers, and the priests kind of fall out of favor of that, the moral tradition as far as enforcing laws. There were still some things that judges, though, would go after you morally, especially when it came to curse tablets and like stalking people or doing things at night that was creepy. Setting fires inside the city, that was considered not just illegal, but it was considered like a moral wrong because it could kill a bunch of people. It was also considered treason. You'd be executed for that. So besides civil law, civil and criminal law, both there, law of nations, diplomatic law, going back to that first lecture I gave, I talked about that a little bit, where the Romans, even from the get-go, even from probably the 7 to 8, maybe 7 or 600s BC, were already into making pretty good negotiations with their neighbors, allowing their neighbors to become friends and allies and eventually Roman citizens. Okay. Natural law, of course, Greeks and Romans both have philosophical treatises on this. Natural law, we all know, maybe if you read John Locke or something like this, discussing, what is natural law? What is what laws do we have in nature? Are more animalistic, tooth and claw, right? And then you have to kind of give up some of those freedoms, animalistic freedoms, to live in a city and actually have greater protections. The social contract. Okay, so some of that is that. Jurists were legal scholars that weren't really lawyers. These were aristocrats. It was considered kind of dirty to practice law in Rome, and you weren't technically supposed to take money. You could take a gift for it, but like even in Cicero's time, you weren't supposed to be like getting paid to be a lawyer. You were supposed to be practicing your skills of oratory and just studying the law. So you had to be kind of a wealthy person to do this. Later on, though, you do see more and more people come in and practicing it in the empire and having to get paid, of course. But these jurists will stick around, though, and these are just the intellectual guys that might want to teach the law, talk about it, but not really practice it, because they consider it kind of dirty. Kind of the same way people might look at an ambulance chaser today, yeah. So of course, it's going to influence European legal codes, and I said even American legal codes, because ours are largely based on English common law. And I don't know if the textbook still says, the textbook kind of said that, Roman law was just codified law. It wasn't statutory law. That's not true. They had both. Statutory law means it's put in, by, now I'm getting mixed up here. You could get laws put in by judges, and that would not be a statute. And then there's codified law put in by legislatures. What am I trying? Precedent law. Precedent law. That's what's put in by a judge. A judge might take a law that has been put through legislation, alter it slightly, and as long as that's a good law, that is precedent law. Romans did do that too. That's what becomes English common law, okay? At least on the similar tradition. So sometimes the text that tries to simplify something, and it kind of messes it up. So if you get into the arguments over Roman law, what Roman law is, it's not just black and white, like it is that or that. No, it's not. There was much more nuance in Roman law. Roman law doesn't get fully codified until under Justinian anyways. So during the whole time we're talking about the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire's height, their law is much more precedent law. And everybody would have carried around a bunch of dossiers with the best law in there. So there's a lot of argument over what was allowable and what was not, and every single case could have been interpreted individually. All right. It's going to influence the Roman Catholic Church as well, not just the law, but the Roman state, Roman institutions, canon law, and their hierarchy. If you look at the Roman Catholic Church today, their hierarchy, of course, still uses the Pontifex Maximus, is the Pope. They have the papal curate, the curia. That used to be the Senate House. Now it's the College of Cardinals. That's the same, not same, but similar thing. And there's other things that they will take out of the either the legal or the administrative hierarchy. All right, I know that was a lot, but that was the Roman Empire in a very small nutshell. Please ask some questions, make comments, and then make comments on each other's comments, but please ask me some questions on any of that stuff. All right, I will talk to you guys soon in the discussions.